an episode of How to Analyse Poetry from the Learning Cauldron. Today we'll be looking at Norman MacCaig's Visiting Hour. Analysing poetry involves identifying and dissecting the literary techniques that the poet has used effectively to explore the theme or themes of a poem. In his poem Visiting Hour, Norman MacCaig explores the themes of isolation, facing loss, and confronting mortality. The title of the poem immediately tells us where we are. Either it's going to be a prison or a hospital, effectively, if there's a visiting hour, and immediately the first line tells us that it's a hospital. And it engages our senses right from the start. This poem uses sense a lot, and here we have the hospital smell. That is a smell that is very characteristic, and almost everyone will be able to identify with it. And then the imagery is that it combs the poet's nostrils. And that gives the idea of something pushing its way through, and therefore there's a feeling of invasion immediately that he walks in, and that gives us an idea of his discomfort in this situation. He tries to make things a little bit more light-hearted, as he says, as they go bobbing along green and yellow corridors. And the idea of these nostrils bobbing on their own devices is certainly light-hearted and more amusing is perhaps too strong, but it's less serious than the rest of the poem. And this is an example of synecdoche, where the nostrils are being used to represent the whole person. The colours used here, green and yellow, to describe the corridors, also emphasise the feeling of discomfort as they connote nausea and sickness, very suitable for this setting in a hospital. In the next stanza, the poet says what seems a corpse. So he's not sure, but he's assuming the worst, that this body that he sees being wheeled is a dead body. And that immediately reminds him of the fact that here in hospital, people can die. And that's not the thing that he wants to think about when he's about to visit a loved one. The word choice of corpse is strong here, as it reminds us of our own mortality as well. And there's enjambment here, where the line continues over onto the next one, vanishes very effectively, because it does vanish off into thin air after that word, and then heavenward, reminding us again that people are dying, moving on, and we may not be able to reach them afterwards. MacCaig is a non-believer, and therefore he didn't actually believe in heaven and hell, but it's interesting, it's almost as if he's trying to find some meaning to all of this. In the next stanza, the technique of repetition is used very effectively. I will not feel, I will not, and the enjambment emphasises the feel, until I have to. And not only is there repetition that we can comment on here, we can also comment on the tone, because that repetition helps create an anxious tone, a tone of the fear of what he might find when he gets to his loved one. Into the next stanza, and he spots the nurses. He's trying to divert himself from the thought of what awaits him when he visits his loved one, and he notices that the nurses seem to be in control. They seem to deal with this terrible job that they have, as far as he can see, in such an easy way. They move lightly and swiftly, and this contrasts dramatically with later on in the poem when he describes himself clumsily and dizzily moving off. He also uses the imagery of a burden to describe the weight of responsibility that these nurses carry in their job every day. And he emphasises this also using the power or the rule of three, with so much pain, so many deaths, their eyes still clear, i.e. free of tears, after so many farewells. And he is in awe, and the tone of awe is shown by this word miraculously, when he sees how well they deal with what he considers to be an almost impossible job. And then if we move on, we've got a fabulous, short, blunt sentence here. It's a minor sentence, there is no verb in it, and we can tell, because he's read this sign, that he's there. The moment that he's been trying to put off, when he said, until I have to, has now come. And it's interesting, this word choice of she, it sounds quite impersonal. Instead of my beloved or my loved one, it's thought it might have been his wife who was ill in hospital for a while, but we can't know for sure, that's just what critics think. But certainly he doesn't mention a name or mention that it's his loving wife. The she is almost as if he's trying to put a distance between himself and this person because he can't bear what's happening to her. The imagery of lies in a white cave of forgetfulness is also very evocative here. Normally one thinks of a cave as being somewhere that somebody goes to be isolated, for example a hermit who lives alone apart from society. And so therefore the use of the idea of the cave is very effective in describing the cubicle, probably with a white sheet drawn round it, that encloses his loved one. And the forgetfulness could be a confusion because she's drugged for pain, or it could be that she's becoming confused just through her illness. And the idea of how in what a poor physical condition his loved one is continued with the image, a withered hand trembles on its stalk. That's her hand. It's trembling, which shows that she's perhaps emotionally distraught, or that she is simply unable to stop trembling because of the malaise, the illness that she has. And the description of withered will be familiar to you if you've ever watched flowers withering in a vase. Basically, they become dehydrated as the head of the flower begins to die, and then it is left hanging on its stalk. And in this case, the stalk is referring to the thin wrist of his loved one who is so ill. Eyes move behind eyelids to heavy. The word choice of heavy here tells us that she is either, again, too drugged to be able to lift her eyes, or that she's too ill. And again, this adds to the feeling of her infirmity, and why we understand why he must be feeling so reluctant to come and see his loved one in this situation. And then we've got a nice use of sound here with a glass fang is fixed, not guzzling, but giving. So the 3 G's are nice and harsh and aggressive, because although he's accepting that this glass fang, which is actually an IV drip, is to give her goodness, nutrients, at first his initial reaction is to see the fang as an attack. For example, there is an analogy of a vampire there when you see the word fang, and it's the idea almost that his loved one is being attacked as she lies there vulnerably because it's fixed in her arm. But then reality dawns and he realises he's perhaps overreacting, and that it is not taking her blood like a vampire would, but that it's actually giving her things that she needs to survive. And then we've got a repetition here of the word distance, and that helps to highlight the theme here of isolation in the poem. She is isolated from him and he is isolated from her. And the enjambment of the distance of pain that neither she nor I can cross helps to emphasise this chasm that has opened up between the two of them. Again, he refers to her as she, and he refers to himself as a black figure in her white cave. A lovely use of contrast, again highlighting how they seem alienated and distant from each other because of these two opposite colours. And again, the imagery of the cave. And I mentioned previously, clumsily and dizzily contrasts nicely with the way the nurses cope with the situation. And we've got some sound here as well. The sibilance of clumsily rises in the round swimming waves of a bell, and dizzily. If you hear all those sibilant S's, that helps to add to the air of confusion here as he realises that visiting time is over because he hears the bell, which used to symbolise the end of visiting hour. And we also have an interesting example here of synesthesia, which is where there is a confusion of the senses. In this case, sound and sight have been confused, and that helps add to his feeling of confusion and his inability to cope with this deeply emotional, traumatic situation. And the whole futility, the pointlessness of this visit in the poet's eyes is emphasised by the last few lines. A lot of MacCaig's poems end by summing up the whole point of the poem, and in this case we have only books that will not be read and fruitless fruits being left behind when he goes. Now, books that are not being read mean that these books are pointless, and fruitless fruits is an oxymoron. It seems to contradict itself. We know that she's on a drip, so she probably can't eat the fruit that he brought her, and she, with her heavy eyes, will not be able to read the books that he brought her either. So therefore, the two things that are almost symbolic of visiting hours, the things that we take people to read and to eat, are futile here. They're pointless, and that just sums up his feeling of the whole visit having been almost a mistake, because he couldn't help her, he couldn't take away her pain, and he also feels very inferior to the nurses who deal so well with such situations. I hope that's been helpful. See you next time.